All right, so today we are going to resume looking at the video Articles of Confederation for Dummies. Here we go.
The good and the bad, we get Practice Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The inflexibility of the articles, 9 out of 13 to pass law, but more importantly, 13 out of 13 states to agree to change that baby, which makes it completely inflexible. You really can't, move forward and change things. And, the structural aspect itself. The idea that there's no president, there's no tax system, there's no court, there's no military, there's no paper money, is all going to make it for kind of a bad slell later on. So let me go get the ugly, and then we're going to be done. Ugly! Miss Ugly, where are you?
With that as a background, let's review what is the good. What did he say was the good of the Articles of Confederation? What good thing did they accomplish? One major thing. All right, so Articles of Confederation for Dummies is still not getting through. Do we need to get Articles of Confederation for really dummies?
Yes.
The establishment of the Northwest Territories was a major accomplishment of the Articles of Confederation because it provided a means by which territories of the United States could one day become states. And not only states, but states of an equal on equal par with the states that are already there. So that enabled places like Ohio, Indiana, and so on to organize as territories, and eventually when they got enough people, they could have their own government and then eventually become a state in the United States. So that was a major accomplishment of the Articles that continued on into the years of the Constitution. Now, what was the bad? We had the good, the bad. What was the bad? What was wrong with the Articles of Confederation? What made it necessary to change it? What are some things that could not happen or were not a part of the Articles of Confederation? Michaela?
Was one of the things that you had to have 9 out of 13.
In order to pass any law, you had to have 9 out of the 13 states approve it. Because each state had how many votes? 1. No matter how many people were in your state got 1 vote. Okay, what else was bad? Alex?
No taxation for the government.
Yeah, the federal government had no way of raising money. There was no taxation. So where did they get their money? Or how would they get their money? Well, you answer questions about this in your text as well. Lydia?
They had to ask the states for money.
Right, ask the states for money, or what's another thing they did?
Asked other nations for money.
Yeah, borrowed money from other nations. And also selling lands, I think, was something that you had in your text as well. All right, anything else that was bad about the Articles? Devin?
Was it that if you wanted to change something, it had to be a unanimous vote?
Right, if you wanted to amend it, if you wanted to make any changes to the Articles of Confederation, it took a unanimous vote of all 13 states. Now, what's the likelihood of that? Not very great, right? All right, so those are there may be something else there too, but that's mostly what was bad. Johanna?
Wasn't it the government had little to no power?
Right, and so because they could not tax, it was difficult to pass any laws. They really didn't have any power. Oh, and in reality, what was the what branches of government were represented in the Articles of Confederation? What are the 3 branches of government? Everybody say it together.
Legislative, executive, and judicial.
Yeah, and you said it in the same order too. You could teach the new representative from New York something Cortez. She doesn't know that. So even Articles of Confederation for Dummies would teach her some things. Now, what's the only branch then that's a part of the Articles of Confederation? Everybody say it together. Right. So So there's no executive. The executive actually is elected from the legislature, much like the Roman Senate, but there's no judiciary at all. They said, well, we'll just let the states handle all judicial aspects. Well, that leads to a weak government, a government that really can't govern. And so when we'll let him continue, and then we'll talk about what happened as a result of those weaknesses. Okay, now the ugly, he says.
I found this, the ugly. The ugly is in the idea of Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion, many exams I've seen that on in New York State for Regents and other exams. They want you to know Shays' Rebellion. In a sense, Shays' Rebellion is really like the kind of the match that's going to set those articles on fire. We've already put the wood down. We put all of those kind of bad aspects and weak aspects and inflexible aspects of the article that's kind of like kindling with gas on it. All you really need is a spark or something to light that fire. And that was Shays' Rebellion. In the state of Massachusetts, Shay was a former Revolutionary War soldier, and he was a little PO'd. He was a little upset that what he felt the government wasn't doing Massachusetts for him, that he was paying taxes, and he really didn't feel that he had proper representation, that he felt he was owed debt from the Revolutionary War. He really thought, in a sense, that the government wasn't doing well by him. So the Declaration teaches you that if the government isn't giving you, your protecting your natural rights or is abusing its power, that you should, force it to change, whether that's through nonviolence or maybe violence in the Revolutionary War. So Shay and his band of followers basically march on the Capitol, basically demanding change, demanding, representation, more representation, and demanding some recourse to their debt problems. So the concept is that, almost if you can be the governor of Massachusetts and look out the window and see this kind of angry mob coming towards you, and you're kind of getting a little nervous, you think...
He's not quite accurate in one thing he said. They weren't demanding one more representation. They had representation. That's part of the problem, is they had representation. It's just that the representation was not acting in the way that they wanted. And so they decided to take the law in their own hands. And in part, the representation that they have was not representing them well. They had their own interests. And so you might say, in a sense, they had no representation. But the system was there for change.
Maybe this is it. Maybe they're going to cut my head off. So you grab the phone, and who do you call? You call your dad. You call the federal government. You call the entity that is there to protect you. And what do you hear on the other end? 1-800-CONGRESS. Uh-oh. They're not going to be able to help. There's hardly anyone on the other end. They have no army. They have no taxpayer power. They had to ask the states for help to go help another state. And it's not that Shays' Rebellion cuts heads off. And it's not that Shays' Rebellion is successful. Eventually they are, captured and they are charged. And I think later some were pardoned, maybe were executed. I'm not an expert on Shays' Rebellion. But what I do know is that it scared the hell out of some people. It scared the hell out of people like Alexander Hamilton and people that had power and land and money, because this really represented the fear of a lot of property owners, was that the day might be coming where they come for us. So we need a federal government with more power. Hence, they wrote the Federalist Papers, which are going to argue for a new constitution. So that's the ugly Shays' Rebellion. Eventually, the states end up in Annapolis, Maryland, at a meeting. It's called the Annapolis Convention, the Annapolis meeting, where they try to scratch their heads and figure out, what are we going to do? So they decide that they're really going to have a convention to change this baby majorly. And Rhode Island, you didn't even show up to the Annapolis Convention. So when you don't show up to the Constitutional Convention, and you need all 13 to be there to make any changes, that's it. Articles of Confederation, poof, goodbye. So I hope that you learned something about the Articles of Confederation. If you learned anything, hopefully you know what federalism is, and now you can say with me that the Articles of Confederation sucked because the feds were too You did it. Good for you. All right, guys. We'll see you in another video lecture. Keep studying, and good for you. See you later.
All right. The convention that was held in Annapolis was for what purpose? To change the Articles of Confederation. How many of you knew that? All right. To change. Did they do that? No. And why did they not do that?
Rhode Island didn't show.
Rhode Island doesn't show up. So they can't. So the one reason why they didn't. The other one was they realized that you really can't change it. You got to replace it. So they really initiate a constitutional convention to write a new constitution. And what would be one of the major goals of this new constitution? What do they need to remedy? The primary thing, the overall idea, principle they need to take care of that will alleviate some of the bad things of the Articles of Confederation. What do they need to do? Michaela? Make the federal government more powerful. Give us some teeth so it can function. Because that's the main thing, right? You list all the things that are bad. Most of it has to do with the idea that the federal government, that is the national government, doesn't have the power or the authority to do much of anything. And so that's what it really it's all going to come about. Now, we're not going to spend time looking at the Constitutional Convention itself. You have probably had that. I think you've had that in middle school. You certainly will talk about that in civics class coming up. But just briefly, let's consider that in the writing of the Constitution, you had representatives from all the different colonies who had input. Who were some of the major people that do you remember who were some of the major people who had a hand in writing the Constitution? But who's considered the father of the U.S. Constitution? James Madison. And that's because he came to the convention with an idea. I would contend, at least from my research, it would seem to me that that's a bit of a misnomer. Because a lot of the things he wanted as a part of the Constitution did not get put in there. And that in fact there was a person who had a lot greater influence on what ended up being in the U.S. Constitution than Madison or anyone else who was at the convention, and he's someone who wasn't even among the delegates. You've heard of him, but you've never heard of him in this way. And that is Noah Webster. Noah Webster was not elected by Massachusetts to represent them at the Constitutional Convention because Noah Webster was an honest man who told people what he really thought. And so in doing that, he offended people, and they didn't elect him. But he was there in Philadelphia and had an apartment there, and apparently in the evenings, men like Washington, Madison, others would go to his apartment and ask Noah, what do you think? Noah Webster. What do you think? Why? Because he had written extensively about government. John Adams had too. John Adams had a major role to play as well. But Noah Webster is kind of the silent partner here in the writing of the Constitution. All right, so we come up with a Constitution. There are the breakdown. Let's talk about that for a moment. What's the breakdown of the U.S. Constitution? Does anybody know what Article 1 is largely about? Well, not largely. It is. What's Article 1 about? What does it address? All right, I'll make it easier for you. What branch of government is addressed in Article 1, the longest article in the Constitution? The legislative branch, yeah. And what do we call the legislature in the U.S. Constitution? What do we call the legislature of the United States? Everybody say it together. Louder. A little bit louder. What is the U.S. legislature called? Congress.
Oh.
Have we heard of Congress? All right. What are the two houses of Congress? Congress is divided into what?
The Senate and the House.
Right, the Senate and the House of Representatives. What are people who are members of the Senate called? Senators. What are people who are members of the House of Representatives called? This is where it's a little tricky. They're called congressmen. Even though Congress refers to both, but they're called congressmen because it was too hard to say House of Representarian or whatever, which some of you were trying to say. So Article 1 is the longest because there's a lot to say about how to set up a legislature. They consider that the most important branch. They consider that the branch that would really run government. All right, Article 2 is about what branch? Everybody say it together. Executive branch, because that's the next important branch of government. Article 3 has very little, and that's about the judicial branch, because basically they said Congress can set up a judiciary. There is a Supreme Court, but beyond that, Congress can figure out what to do. So there wasn't a lot to say about it. So relatively unimportant at the beginning. Now it's become the branch that seems to run everything. All right, let's see. So, and then there are other articles dealing with other areas beyond that, as you know. Well, one of the things you read in your text about the different compromises, the different issues that were there in the Constitutional Convention. Do you remember what some of those issues were? I think there were 3 issues maybe that your text talked about. Do you remember?
I remember 2 of them. State representation.
Representation. How should the states be represented? Now, the Virginia plan, which was proposed by James Madison, was what? How did he feel the states should be represented? According to what? Population. And why did he feel that way? Virginia was bigger than the other ones. So he wants Virginia to have more power in the government, so it should be by population. All right, what was the other viewpoint? Do you remember what state brought forth the other viewpoint? Yeah, New Jersey. Is that right? Yeah, that's right, New Jersey. And how do they feel that the states should be represented? Well, so by population, what is it? Equal. So each state has an equal number, just like they had in the Articles of Confederation. All right. So the compromise was reached. Do you remember what state brought that compromise? It was Connecticut, and their proposal was what? I'll give you a clue. It's what we ended up having in the Constitution. What was it? Oh, what kind of compromise? We have. Should we do it by population, or we should do it by equality? What do we do? Do both. Yeah. So we have 2 houses, which is called bicameral, 2-house legislature. One is by population, which is which one? House of Representatives, and the other is each state has an equal number, which is the Senate. And how many is that number? 2. 2 votes for each state. So 2 senators for each state. All right. What was the other area that was difficult?
How slaves would be counted.
Right. Now, well, that is according to representation and taxation. Now, who would want slaves to be counted totally in representation. The slave states, right? Because they want to have more representatives, and so, yeah, we'll count all our slaves. Give us more people. Who wants them to be counted for taxation purposes only? The northern states. All right. So the compromise was what? By the way, without ever mentioning the word slave in the Constitution, what was the compromise? Each slave is worth 3/5 of a person. Isn't that great? But that was the compromise they came to. So that appeased both sides temporarily. All right, what's another area that was an issue?
Trade.
Trade. That was because each state kind of wanted to run their own things, but there needed to be federal oversight. Because you can't have Virginia having a trade agreement with France, and at the same time Massachusetts is going to war with France. That doesn't work very well. And so there needed to be a federal oversight, national oversight. Well, one of the things that is not often addressed there's Shays' Rebellion. One of the things that led to the immediacy of calling a constitutional convention and getting things changed. And that is the role of prayer. The Constitutional Convention had been wrangling over these issues, these and others, for some time and not getting anywhere. When Ben Franklin made this speech, take a look at it. He said, "Mr. President, the small progress we have made after 4 or 5 weeks, close attendance and continual reasonings with each other, our different sentiments on almost every question, several of the last producing as many no's as ayes, is methinks a melancholy proof of the imperfection of the human understanding." You know, we're not getting anywhere because we're not perfect and we just don't have an understanding of one another. We indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom since we have been running about in search of it. We have gone back to ancient history for models of government and examined the different forms of those republics which, having been formed with the seeds of their own dissolution, now no longer exist. So I said, we're looking at ancient governments that no longer exist, for example, and we viewed modern states all around Europe but find none of their constitutions suitable to our circumstances. So we're looking everywhere. We've looked at ancient history, we've looked at modern states to find examples of how we can form our government. In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings. In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for the divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in this struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind of providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? What's Franklin saying? He said, when we first started this war of independence of Great Britain, we were relying upon God. And there are lots of times during the war that we can very clearly say, wow, God really helped us out there. God really did something here. And now we're at a place where, because of God's providence, because of God's acting on our behalf, we're in a place now where we're trying to establish a country, and we're at peace, and we have the leisure to do that. And what have we done? We've forgotten the one that got us here. We've forgotten all about God. I have lived, sir, a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future age. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter this unfortunate instance, despairing of establishing governments by human wisdom, and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service. Isn't that something? What a speech by Benjamin Franklin, who many today claim was a deist, that God doesn't intervene in the affairs of men, that God's just out there somewhere and just kind of watching things and doesn't do anything. Doesn't sound like a deist, does he? And for what he said there, he sounds like someone who believes that God really does involve himself in the affairs of men. And you know the thing is that after he recommended it, now it's funny, they did have some squabbles over who was going to pray and whether those that were not Anglican could listen to an Anglican pray or not, you know, but they got over that. But once they started praying before each meeting, they started finding the compromises. They started finding a way to write this Constitution. And so we come to the statement by Patrick Henry, who was against the Constitution, but he said this: it cannot be emphasized too strongly or too often that this great nation was founded not by religionists, but by Christians, not on religions, but on the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, as the Constitution was written, of course, it had to be ratified or approved by each of the 13 states, or in order to go into effect, it had to be approved by 9 out of the 13 states. And this map shows you the order in which they ratified. If you ever see a license plate from Delaware, it might you might see it says on it the constitutional state, maybe, or the first in the Constitution. Anyway, they're the first ones to ratify the Constitution. And you can see Pennsylvania is second, and on down. So we got up to 9. South Carolina was number 9, but that still left a few very important states, including Virginia and New York. Why were Virginia and New York so important? They're the biggest, the most populous. And it was rightly assumed that if you don't get them on board, you're not going to have a country, even if you do have 9 states. Because can you imagine a United States of America that is down here and here and here, that doesn't include New York and Virginia? That would be pretty silly. So the push was on to get them to approve it as well, and they eventually did. A large influence toward ratifying the Constitution was from a group of a series of articles written, which are called the Federalist Papers. Does anybody remember who were the authors of the Federalist Papers? There were 3 people that were largely part of that. Very good. The primary author was Alexander Hamilton, and he is probably, I would say, the best of the 3 writing. John Jay, I'm not sure if he wrote even more than 1 article. We can't know for sure because they didn't put their names on it. So you just have to tell by writing style. But Madison is a little bit harder to follow than Hamilton. And especially New York and Virginia, those had a great effect on ratifying the Constitution. All right, so we have a Constitution. We have in the Constitution not one branch of government, but all 3. The legislative, executive, and judicial branches of government. Oh, I should mention that one of the things that, especially Virginia and some in New York found lacking was they were afraid that the constitutional government would take away citizens' rights. And so they were concerned about that, and they said, look, we'll ratify the Constitution if you promise that you will put in the Constitution a list of rights that citizens have that the federal government can't take away. And that was the first thing that the new Congress did, was to amend the Constitution. The first 10 amendments then are called what? The Bill of Rights. A very important part of our Constitution. And you'll see that referenced, I think, as we watch the movie about George Washington. All right, so we come to the inauguration of the first president of the United States, and this is what George Washington had to say. It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. We ought to be no less persuaded that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. Kind of makes you think about today, doesn't it? Because we, as a nation, have disregarded the eternal rules of order and right that God has ordained. You guys are too young to remember, in the aftermath of 9/11, all the signs that were up all over the country, God bless America, and people were flocking into churches. I was not persuaded that a major spiritual change had taken place in our country. And my initial reaction to all those signs was, yeah, that's great. God bless America, calling on God. But then I thought, how can you say God bless America until you can say America bless God? And we weren't willing to do that. Our nation was not willing to submit itself to God. They just wanted God to bless us, but they didn't want to submit America to Him. For tomorrow, I want you to read a couple of more handouts, and then we'll start watching George Washington, Forging of a Nation. I want you to read handouts, read and highlight handouts number 10 and 11. Handouts number 10 and 11. And you can get started on that. You can get quite a bit of that done in the time we have left. Handouts 10 and 11. Oh, one more thing I forgot to mention. We got to get this straight. The people who were in favor of ratifying the Constitution were called what? Federalists. And those who were against ratifying the Constitution were called, it's easy, anti-federalists. See how easy that was?